Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the Arkansas Ozarks. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know in which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the autumn of 1892, the remote valleys and hollows of Carroll County, Arkansas, became the center of events that would challenge the understanding of medical authorities, law enforcement officials, and academic researchers for generations to come. What began as whispered concerns among isolated farming families would escalate into a phenomenon so disturbing that its full documentation was suppressed for nearly 3 decades. Carroll County in 1892 occupied a particularly isolated position in the northwestern corner of Arkansas, where the Boston Mountains give way to rugged limestone bluffs and deep forested valleys. The county had been established in 1833, named for Charles Carroll of Carrollton, the last surviving signer of the Declaration of Independence, but by the 1890s it remained largely unchanged from frontier conditions. The primary settlements of Berryville and Eureka Springs served as commercial centers, but between them stretched miles of nearly impassable terrain where families lived in conditions that would have been familiar to settlers 50 years prior. The White River and its tributaries carved through the landscape, creating countless hollows and coves where a family could establish a homestead and remain virtually unknown to their nearest neighbors, sometimes living 15 to 20 miles from the nearest town. The geology of the region played a crucial role in the events that would unfold. Carroll County sits atop extensive limestone formations that have been carved by underground water systems over millions of years, creating one of the most complex cave systems in the American interior. According to geological surveys conducted by the United States Geological Survey in 1889, the county contained at least 47 documented cave systems, with many more suspected to exist in unexplored areas. These caves ranged from simple rock shelters to vast underground networks featuring rivers, waterfalls, and chambers of cathedral-like proportions. The locals had long known of these formations, and stories circulated among the mountain people about caves that ran for miles beneath the hills, connecting distant valleys in ways that surface travelers could never traverse. Into this isolated landscape arrived a man who would become known in local accounts as Dr. Silas Crow, though whether he possessed any legitimate medical credentials remained a matter of considerable dispute. The earliest documented reference to Crow appears in the Berryville Eagle, a weekly newspaper published in the county seat in its edition, dated March 17, 1891. The brief notice, buried among advertisements and social news, announced that a new physician had established practice in the remote community of Trimble, located in the southern reaches of the county along the banks of Leatherwood Creek. The notice provided few details about Crow's background, stating only that he had arrived from the East and specialized in the treatment of chronic ailments that had proven resistant to conventional medical approaches. What made Crow distinctive, and what would later become the subject of intense scrutiny, was the symbol he adopted as his professional mark, a silver crescent moon, which appeared on a wooden sign hung outside his cabin and was reportedly embroidered on a black cloth banner that he displayed during his consultations. According to testimony later collected by Marshall County Sheriff Thomas Wickham, who investigated the case extensively between 1893 and 1895, Crow explained to patients that the Crescent represented the ancient healing traditions he practiced, traditions that acknowledged the cyclical nature of life and death, health and disease. The Crescent, Crow allegedly stated, symbolized the transition between states of being, the liminal space where transformation occurred. The Trimble community into which Crow inserted himself consisted of perhaps 40 families scattered across a valley approximately 12 miles long and 5 miles wide. These were predominantly families of German and Scots-Irish extraction who had migrated to Arkansas in the 1850s and 1860s seeking affordable land and the independence that remote mountain living provided. They were subsistence farmers primarily, growing corn and wheat in the bottomlands, keeping hogs and cattle, and supplementing their diet with hunting and fishing. Medical care in such communities remained primitive, even by the standards of the era. The nearest licensed physician practiced in Berryville, a journey of 23 miles over rough mountain roads that could become impassable during winter months or heavy rains. As a result, communities like Trimble relied heavily on traditional remedies, midwives, and itinerant healers who traveled the mountain circuits offering their services. Crow's arrival was initially welcomed. The cabin he occupied had previously belonged to a family named Hollister, who had abandoned their claim after losing 3 children to diphtheria in the winter of 1889. The structure sat at the mouth of what locals called Crescent Hollow, a narrow valley that ran back into the hills for approximately 2 miles before terminating at a limestone cliff face. Behind Crow's cabin, perhaps a quarter-mile up the hollow, gaped the entrance to a cave system known locally as Hollister Cave, though some of the older residents referred to it by an earlier name that suggested Native American origins. According to notes compiled by Dr. Marcus Pemberton, who conducted a medical investigation into the events in 1896, the cave entrance measured approximately 12 feet high and 20 feet wide, and the main passage extended back into the hillside for at least half a mile before becoming impassable without specialized equipment. For the first several months of his residence, Crow practiced what appeared to be relatively conventional frontier medicine. He treated respiratory ailments with herbal preparations, set broken bones, lanced boils, and prescribed various tonics for general weakness and malaise. His fees were modest, generally paid in produce, livestock, or labor rather than cash, which endeared him to families who possessed little actual currency. Several testimonies collected later indicated that Crow demonstrated genuine medical knowledge and achieved results that surprised and pleased his patients. Martha Wickens, whose diary covering the years 1890 to 1893 was preserved by her granddaughter and eventually deposited with the Carroll County Historical Society, wrote in an entry dated June 14, 1891, that Crow had successfully treated her husband's infected hand wound, which had resisted all home remedies and threatened to require amputation. She described Crow as quiet and professional, noting that he spent considerable time examining patients before prescribing treatment. The first indication that Crow's practice might involve elements beyond conventional medicine appeared in the autumn of 1891. According to multiple accounts, including testimony given to Sheriff Wickham by residents James Turnbull and Sarah Carpenter, Crow began to alter his consultation procedures in ways that struck some patients as unusual. He started requiring that consultations take place after sunset, explaining that certain diagnoses required conditions of darkness to be performed accurately. He also began asking detailed questions about patients' deceased relatives, inquiring about their causes of death, their final illnesses, and whether any debts or obligations had remained unsettled at the time of death. These questions caused discomfort among some community members, but others rationalized them as attempts to understand hereditary health conditions that might inform current treatment. More troubling were the changes observed in Crow's physical appearance and daily habits during this period. Multiple witnesses noted that he seemed to sleep during daylight hours, with his cabin shuttered and dark throughout the day. Smoke from his chimney appeared only after nightfall. On several occasions, residents traveling past his cabin late at night reported seeing lights not in the cabin itself, but further up Crescent Hollow, near the cave entrance, suggesting that Crow spent considerable time in the cave system for purposes that remained unclear. Samuel Dockery, a farmer whose property bordered Crow's on the eastern side, told investigators that he had observed Crow carrying bundles wrapped in black cloth into the cave on multiple nights in November 1891, bundles that appeared to be heavy and required considerable effort to transport. The winter of 1891 to 1892 brought harsh conditions to Carroll County, with heavy snows isolating many communities for weeks at a time. It was during this period that Crow's practice took its most disturbing turn, though the full nature of the transformation would not become apparent until spring. What is documented is that several families in the Trimble area experienced deaths during the winter months, deaths that were not in themselves unusual given the season and the prevalence of respiratory diseases in the mountain communities. What became unusual was Crow's response to these deaths and his interactions with the grieving families. The first documented case involved the Schaffer family, German immigrants who had established a prosperous farm in the valley in 1868. Heinrich Schaffer, the family patriarch, died on January 9, 1892, at the age of 73, following a brief illness characterized by fever and difficulty breathing. According to the account given by his son, Wilhelm Schaffer, to investigators in 1893, Crow appeared at the Schaffer home uninvited on the evening of Heinrich's death, explaining that he had sensed that his services might be needed. The family, uncertain how Crow could have known of the death so quickly given the distance between properties and the snow conditions, nevertheless welcomed him, assuming he had come to offer condolences or perhaps to prepare the body for burial, a service frontier doctors sometimes provided. What Crow offered instead would establish a pattern that would be repeated with terrible consequences over the following months. According to Wilhelm Schaffer's testimony, Crow expressed sympathy for the family's loss and then raised the matter of a debt. The Schaffer family, he noted, had consulted him for medical services the previous autumn, when Heinrich had suffered from rheumatism and painful joints. Crow had provided treatments consisting of compounded herbal preparations that he claimed included rare ingredients acquired at considerable expense. The family had paid partially for these services with a side of cured pork, but Crow now asserted that the full value of his treatments had not been compensated. He estimated that the family still owed him an amount equivalent to approximately $40, a substantial sum for a farming family in that time and place. The Schaffer family disputed this claim, maintaining that they had paid for the services rendered according to the agreement reached at the time. Wilhelm Schaffer described a heated discussion during which he demanded that Crow leave the house, stating that it was unconscionable to press financial claims at the very moment of bereavement. What happened next would be reported in remarkably consistent terms by multiple families over the following months, suggesting that Crow employed a carefully rehearsed presentation. According to Wilhelm Schaffer, Crow's demeanor changed abruptly from confrontational to conciliatory. He apologized for any misunderstanding and stated that he had not come to demand payment from the living, but rather to offer an alternative solution that would honor the deceased while resolving the debt. Crow explained that he practiced what he termed restoration medicine, a discipline that recognized the continuation of obligations beyond the threshold of death. In his understanding, a debt incurred by a person during their lifetime did not simply vanish when that person ceased to breathe, but rather attached itself to the physical remains and could be discharged through specific procedures that he had mastered. He offered to perform such a procedure for the Schaffer family, one that would allow Heinrich to pay the debt himself, relieving his survivors of any financial obligation. The payment, Crow assured them, would be extracted not from the living, but from what he called the residual vitality that remained in the deceased for a period of hours or days after death occurred. The Schaffer family initially dismissed this proposal as either madness or an elaborate deception. They ordered Crow to leave, and he departed without further argument. However, according to Wilhelm Schaffer's later testimony, a series of disturbing events began almost immediately. That same night, family members reported hearing sounds outside the house, sounds that they described as heavy footsteps circling the building. The family's dogs, normally fierce in defense of their territory, cowered silently under the porch rather than challenging the intruder. In the morning, tracks were found in the snow, tracks that began at the tree line and approached to within feet of the house before retreating back toward the forest. What made these tracks disturbing was not their presence, but their characteristics. They appeared to be bare human footprints despite the freezing temperatures, and they were accompanied by what witnesses described as a dragging mark, as though something heavy had been pulled through the snow alongside the walker. Over the following 3 nights, the disturbances escalated. Family members reported that the sounds came closer to the house and persisted for longer periods. Objects were found moved or overturned in the morning. Most disturbingly, Wilhelm's wife, Greta Schaffer, reported on the morning of January 13th that she had seen a figure standing at the window of the room where Heinrich's body lay prepared for burial. She described the figure as impossibly tall and thin, silhouetted against the moonlit snow, and stated that when she cried out in alarm, it did not flee but instead remained motionless for several seconds before withdrawing slowly from view. On January 14, 1892, 5 days after Heinrich's death and 1 day before the planned burial, Wilhelm Schaffer walked the difficult miles through snow to Crow's cabin. According to his testimony, he found Crow waiting, as though his arrival had been expected. Wilhelm stated that he agreed to Crow's procedure not because he believed in its legitimacy, but because he hoped that complying would end the nightly disturbances that had left his family terrified and sleepless. Crow agreed to perform the procedure that very night and instructed Wilhelm to tell no one of their arrangement and to ensure that the body remained in the house rather than being moved to the church some families preferred. What transpired that night would be reconstructed only partially through Wilhelm Schaffer's reluctant testimony, given under considerable pressure from investigators more than a year later. He stated that Crow arrived at the Schaffer home approximately 2 hours after sunset, carrying a leather case and a cloth bundle. He requested that all family members leave the house except Wilhelm himself, who Crow said must witness the procedure to verify that the debt had been properly discharged. Wilhelm sent his wife and children to stay with neighbors, claiming that there were concerns about the integrity of the roof under the weight of accumulated snow. Once alone with the body, Crow began a procedure that Wilhelm struggled to describe coherently. Crow unpacked various implements from his case, including what appeared to be silver instruments of unknown purpose, glass vessels, and several candles that burned with an unusual greenish flame. He arranged these items around the table where Heinrich's body lay, and then unwrapped the cloth bundle to reveal a book which Wilhelm described as extremely old, bound in dark leather that had a strange texture that he did not wish to touch. The book contained text in a language Wilhelm did not recognize, though he noted that some symbols resembled crude drawings of crescents and stars. Crow proceeded to recite passages from this book in a low, rhythmic voice, while performing actions that Wilhelm found increasingly difficult to watch. According to his testimony, Crow made incisions in the body at specific points, primarily around the chest and throat, using one of the silver instruments. He collected fluid in the glass vessels, fluid that Wilhelm insisted should not have flowed so freely from a body that had been dead for 5 days. Most disturbing was Wilhelm's claim that as the procedure progressed, Heinrich's body appeared to change. The flesh, which had taken on the grayish pallor and stiffness of death, seemed to become more pliant and acquired what Wilhelm described as an almost lifelike warmth and color. The procedure concluded with Crow pressing one of the silver instruments, which Wilhelm compared to a stylus or needle, against various points on the body, while consulting the book and reciting what sounded like measurements or calculations. Finally, Crow declared that the debt had been paid in full. He produced a receipt written on a small card and instructed Wilhelm to keep it as proof that no further obligation existed. Crow then carefully cleaned and repacked his implements, wrapped the book in its cloth covering, and departed into the night. Wilhelm stated that after Crow's departure, he examined his father's body and found the incisions had been precisely sutured closed with such skill that they would likely not be noticed by anyone preparing the body for burial. The nightly disturbances ceased immediately. The Schaffer family buried Heinrich the following day without incident, and Wilhelm paid Crow an additional sum in silver coins, though he insisted to investigators that this was not payment for the procedure, but rather an incentive to ensure that Crow never spoke of what had occurred. Wilhelm stated that he had resolved to forget the entire incident and had warned his family never to discuss it with anyone outside their immediate household. However, the Schaffer case was not isolated. Through patient investigation and careful review of fragmentary records, researchers have documented at least 17 similar cases occurring between January and October of 1892, all centered in the Trimble area of Carroll County. The pattern remained remarkably consistent. A death would occur in a family that had previously consulted Crow for medical services. Crow would appear to press a claim for payment. Disturbances would begin when families refused his unusual offer, and ultimately the families would acquiesce to his procedure. In some cases, families reported the disturbances to authorities, but the remote location and the difficulty of travel meant that by the time any official could investigate, the situation had typically been resolved through the family's agreement to Crow's terms. The Berryville Eagle, in its edition dated April 28, 1890, published a brief article titled "Strange Reports from Trimble District" that acknowledged unusual stories circulating among residents of the southern county. The article, written with the skepticism common to frontier journalism, noted that several families had reported unusual nighttime disturbances following recent deaths, and that superstitious explanations were being offered. The article concluded with a reminder that education and reason must prevail over mountain folk beliefs, and suggested that some enterprising individual might be exploiting credulous families for profit. This article represented the first published acknowledgement that something unusual was occurring, though it would be months before the full scope of Crow's activities would be documented. Perhaps the most detailed account of Crow's procedure comes from the testimony of Dr. Marcus Pemberton, who investigated the matter in 1896 as part of a medical inquiry into frontier health practices. Pemberton interviewed multiple families and reviewed physical evidence, including the receipt cards that Crow provided to families. His report, published in the Journal of Frontier Medicine in December 1897, provides clinical observations that, while refusing to endorse supernatural explanations, acknowledge phenomena that challenged conventional medical understanding. Pemberton obtained possession of 3 of Crow's receipt cards through families willing to surrender them. He described them as approximately 3 inches by 5 inches, made of unusually thick paper stock with a waxy texture and bearing printing in black ink. Each card contained the name of the deceased, a date, and a series of numbers that Pemberton interpreted as possibly representing measurements or calculations. Most intriguingly, each card bore an impression of the crescent symbol, not printed, but rather appearing to be burned or branded into the paper. Pemberton subjected one card to chemical analysis and reported that the paper contained trace elements of silver and an unidentified organic compound that produced an unusual odor when heated. More controversially, Pemberton examined the body of one individual who had been subjected to Crow's procedure and had died subsequently from an unrelated cause several months later, allowing for post-mortem examination. Pemberton documented the presence of precisely executed incisions that had healed with minimal scarring, suggesting surgical skill of a remarkably high order for the time and place. He also noted what he termed anomalous tissue formations around certain incision sites, describing cellular structures that appeared neither fully normal nor clearly pathological. His report carefully avoided drawing definitive conclusions, but noted that these findings warranted further investigation by researchers with access to more sophisticated analytical equipment. The situation in Trimble might have continued indefinitely, with Crow practicing his unusual specialty and families either submitting to his procedures or, in some cases, arranging to have their dead removed quickly to distant cemeteries beyond his reach. However, in the late summer of 1892, events took a darker turn that would ultimately bring the matter to the attention of county authorities and legal officials. The catalyst was the death of young Sarah Dockery, the 12-year-old daughter of Samuel and Rebecca Dockery, the same Samuel Dockery who had previously observed Crow's nighttime activities around the cave entrance. Sarah died on August 19, 1892, from what was described as brain fever, likely some form of meningitis or encephalitis. According to testimony given by Rebecca Dockery to a circuit court inquiry in 1894, Crow appeared at their home on the evening of Sarah's death, arriving uninvited as had become his pattern. He expressed condolences, but then raised the matter of medical services he claimed to have provided to the family several months earlier, when Sarah had suffered from a persistent cough. The Dockery family adamantly denied owing any debt to Crow. Samuel Dockery maintained that Crow had indeed visited when Sarah was ill, but that his recommended treatments had proven ineffective, and the family had ultimately cured the condition through remedies provided by a traditional healer from the Cherokee community near Berryville. No payment had been requested or offered at the time, and Dockery insisted that no debt existed. He ordered Crow from his property and threatened violence if the healer returned. According to multiple testimonies, what followed was a systematic campaign of terror against the Dockery family that exceeded anything previously reported. The disturbances began that same night and continued for 6 consecutive nights. Family members reported sounds of something moving on the roof of their cabin, sounds so loud that they feared the structure might collapse. Their livestock became agitated, with horses breaking free from their pens and fleeing into the forest. The family's milk cow was found dead on the morning of August 2nd, with no visible wounds, but with what Samuel Dockery described as an expression of such terror frozen on its face that he could not bring himself to butcher the animal for meat. Most horrifying were the sightings that multiple family members reported independently. On the night of August 23rd, both Samuel and Rebecca claimed to have seen their daughter Sarah standing at the edge of the tree line, clearly visible in the moonlight despite having been dead for 4 days, and despite the fact that her body lay prepared for burial inside the house. Rebecca stated that the figure wore Sarah's burial dress and stood motionless for several minutes before retreating into the darkness. Samuel attempted to pursue the figure, but found no tracks or any evidence of its passage. The following night, August 24th, Samuel stationed himself outside the house with his rifle, determined to confront whoever or whatever was tormenting his family. According to his testimony, at approximately 2 hours past midnight, he observed 3 figures approaching the house from the direction of Crescent Hollow. 2 of the figures appeared to be adult-sized, while the third was smaller, approximately the size of a child. They moved with what Samuel described as an unnatural gait, not quite walking, but rather gliding across the ground. As they drew closer, Samuel recognized one of the adult figures as Crow, based on his distinctive tall, thin frame and his characteristic long coat. Samuel fired a warning shot into the air and shouted for the figures to halt and identify themselves. According to his testimony, the figures stopped but did not flee. Crow's voice called out from the darkness, stating that he had come to collect what was owed and that the Dockery family could either negotiate or continue to suffer the consequences of their refusal. Samuel fired a second shot, this time aiming deliberately at Crow. He insisted that his aim was true and that the shot should have struck Crow's center mass at a distance of perhaps 40 yards. However, Crow remained standing. The 3 figures then retreated into the darkness, and Samuel found no blood or any evidence of a hit when he examined the ground at first light. On August 25th, Samuel Dockery made the difficult journey to Berryville to report the matter to Sheriff Thomas Wickham. Wickham's official report, preserved in the Carroll County Courthouse records, documents that he initially received Dockery's account with skepticism, viewing it as the product of grief and perhaps excessive consumption of alcohol, which frontier families sometimes use to cope with bereavement. However, Wickham was a thorough officer who believed in investigating all complaints, regardless of how implausible they might initially appear. He agreed to travel to Trimble to interview other residents and assess the situation. Sheriff Wickham arrived in Trimble on August 28, 1892, accompanied by his deputy, Charles Morton. Over the following 3 days, they conducted interviews with more than a dozen families and heard accounts that, in Wickham's words, presented the most unusual situation I have encountered in 22 years of law enforcement. The consistency of the accounts impressed Wickham. Multiple families independently described similar patterns of nighttime disturbances following deaths. Crow's unusual debt collection practices and the procedures he performed that supposedly discharged these debts through the bodies of the deceased. Wickham decided to confront Crow directly. On August 30th, he and Deputy Morton traveled to Crow's cabin at the mouth of Crescent Hollow. They found the cabin apparently abandoned, with no smoke from the chimney despite the cool temperature and no response to their repeated calls and knocks. Wickham, operating under his authority to investigate potential crimes, forced entry to the cabin. His report describes a sparsely furnished interior containing a bed, a table, several chairs, and shelves lined with glass bottles and jars containing various substances, some of which appeared to be herbal preparations, while others contained materials Wickham could not identify. Most significantly, Wickham noted the complete absence of any personal effects or documents that might establish Crow's identity, background, or credentials. Of particular interest was a locked cabinet that Wickham forced open. Inside, he found several of the receipt cards, similar to those that families had described, but these bore no names or dates and appeared to be blank templates. He also found a quantity of the unusual thick paper stock, several silver implements similar to those described by Wilhelm Schaffer, and a small wooden box containing what appeared to be silver coins of unfamiliar origin, bearing symbols that included crescents and stars, but no recognizable national insignia. The book that multiple witnesses had described was notably absent, as was any clothing or personal items suggesting recent habitation. What Wickham found most disturbing was evidence suggesting that the cabin served primarily as a public face for activities conducted elsewhere. He discovered a partially concealed trapdoor beneath a rug in the corner of the cabin. This trapdoor opened onto a narrow passage that descended steeply into darkness. Wickham and Morton, equipped with oil lanterns, descended approximately 40 feet through what appeared to be a natural limestone fissure that had been widened and improved with crude steps carved into the rock. The passage terminated at an underground stream approximately 10 feet wide that flowed through a cave passage large enough for a man to walk upright. Wickham's report notes that they followed this underground passage for approximately 200 yards, moving generally in the direction of the visible cave entrance further up Crescent Hollow. They encountered several side passages, but maintained their course along the stream. Eventually, they reached a chamber that showed clear evidence of regular use. The chamber measured approximately 20 feet in diameter, with a ceiling lost in darkness above their lantern light. The floor had been leveled and cleared of loose rock. Most significantly, the chamber contained several wooden crates and a table on which were arranged numerous glass vessels, bottles, and implements similar to those found in the cabin. Deputy Morton's supplementary report, which provides details that Wickham's official document omits, describes additional findings that both officers found deeply disturbing. On and around the table, they observed stains that appeared to be biological in origin, possibly blood, though the poor lighting made definitive identification impossible. More troubling were marks on the stone walls of the chamber, marks that had been deliberately carved or painted and that formed patterns incorporating crescent shapes, stars, and symbols that neither officer recognized. Morton also reported a pervasive odor in the chamber that he struggled to describe, comparing it to a combination of medical antiseptic and something organic, and unpleasant, similar to advanced decay. Most significantly, both officers reported finding what appeared to be a journal or ledger, bound in the same dark leather that witnesses had described when discussing Crow's mysterious book. This volume contained entries in two distinct formats: pages of text in an unknown script that appeared similar to but distinct from any language either man had encountered, and pages containing what appeared to be medical or anatomical diagrams accompanied by measurements and calculations written in conventional Arabic numerals. Several of the diagrams depicted human figures marked with points corresponding to locations where Crow had allegedly made incisions during his procedures. Wickham confiscated this ledger as evidence, though he noted in his report that its contents would require expert analysis to interpret meaningfully. The officers spent several additional hours exploring the cave system, but found no sign of Crow himself. They did discover two additional chambers that showed evidence of use, including what appeared to be sleeping quarters with bedding and personal effects, suggesting that Crow spent considerable time in the cave system rather than in his surface cabin. They also found a large natural chamber containing what Morton's report describes as a surprising and unsettling sight. Dozens of small objects arranged in precise rows on the stone floor. These objects appeared to be personal items such as buttons, locks of hair, small articles of clothing, and other materials that might have been taken from the deceased. Each item or group of items was separated from the others by approximately 1 foot, creating a grid-like pattern that covered much of the chamber floor. Unable to locate Crow, and uncertain about the legal status of his activities, Wickham sealed the cabin and posted notice that the property was under investigation by county authorities. He returned to Berryville with the ledger and other evidence, intending to consult with the county prosecutor about potential charges. However, determining what crime Crow might have committed proved challenging. The families, while disturbed by his methods, had ultimately agreed to his procedures. No bodies showed evidence of mistreatment beyond the incisions that Crow had carefully sutured. The disturbances families reported, while frightening, had caused no physical harm and could potentially be attributed to natural causes. Overactive imaginations or even deliberate fraud by Crow or accomplices using trickery to intimidate families into compliance. The case became more complicated when several families, including the Shaffers, refused to testify against Crow or even to acknowledge that anything unusual had occurred. According to correspondence between Wickham and the county prosecutor, preserved in courthouse records, these families expressed concern that publicly discussing Crow's procedures might expose them to ridicule or, more troubling, might somehow void the debt clearance they believed had been achieved. The families that did agree to provide testimony, including the Dockerys, found themselves subject to social pressure and whispered accusations that they were spreading lies or attempting to avoid legitimate debts through slander. In September 1892, the situation took an unexpected turn. The Berryville Eagle published a letter dated September 10th, signed simply as a medical practitioner of the old ways, which many readers assumed to be from Crow himself, though this was never confirmed. The letter defended the practice of restoration medicine as an ancient healing discipline that had been suppressed by modern medical establishments who feared competition and who could not understand methodologies that transcended their mechanistic view of the human body. The letter asserted that death was not the absolute termination that conventional medicine claimed, but rather a transition period during which the body retained certain capacities that could be utilized for purposes both medical and financial. The letter concluded by stating that the practitioner in question had caused no harm, had operated with the consent of all parties involved, and had simply offered a service that families were free to accept or reject. This letter provoked considerable controversy. Several local physicians, including Dr. William Hartman of Berryville, published responses condemning the practices described as medical fraud at best and desecration of the dead at worst. Religious leaders, particularly Reverend Matthias Schoen of the Lutheran Church in Berryville and Father Patrick Donovan of the Catholic Mission in Eureka Springs, issued statements declaring that any interference with the dead beyond necessary preparation for burial violated both natural law and Christian teaching. However, the letter also found defenders, particularly among residents of more remote areas, who maintained that city doctors and distant religious authorities had no right to dictate the practices of mountain communities who had always relied on traditional healers and independent medical practitioners. The debate might have continued indefinitely in the pages of local newspapers, but on the night of October 12, 1890, an event occurred that would permanently alter the trajectory of the case. Samuel Dockery, whose family had been the most vocal in opposing Crow and demanding official action, disappeared under circumstances that remain mysterious to this day. According to Rebecca Dockery's testimony at a subsequent inquiry, Samuel had spent the evening at home with his family, retired to bed at his normal hour, and was discovered missing when Rebecca woke shortly after midnight to find his side of the bed empty and cooling. Despite immediate searches by family members and neighbors, no trace of Samuel was found that night. A comprehensive search conducted over the following 3 days involved more than 50 men from the Trimble area and surrounding communities. They searched the forests, valleys, and fields surrounding the Dockery property, paying particular attention to areas where someone might have fallen or become injured. Sheriff Wickham organized the search and brought tracking dogs from Fort Smith, but the dogs showed no consistent trail leading away from the Dockery home. On the second day of searching, the search party discovered Samuel's nightclothes neatly folded, placed on a flat rock, approximately 1 mile from his home, in the direction of Crescent Hollow. The clothes bore no signs of struggle or bloodstains, and the location where they were found showed no tracks or any evidence of how they had been transported there. Most disturbing was the discovery on the third day of searching. A group of men exploring the area around Hollister Cave found evidence of recent activity within the cave system. Following passages that extended beyond the areas previously explored by Sheriff Wickham, they discovered another large chamber approximately half a mile into the cave system. This chamber showed extensive evidence of occupation and use, including improvised furniture, storage containers, and a significant collection of books and papers. The chamber also contained something that caused the searchers to immediately summon Sheriff Wickham, what appeared to be an operating table constructed from wood and stone, surrounded by an array of medical instruments, glass vessels, and the same silver implements that had been found in Crow's cabin. Sheriff Wickham's report describes the scene in clinical detail that barely conceals his evident disturbance. The table showed extensive staining consistent with biological fluids. Arranged around it were instruments that combined characteristics of medical equipment with designs that served no purpose Wickham could identify. Several glass vessels contained preserved specimens, including what appeared to be organ tissues suspended in clear fluid. Most significantly, Wickham found another ledger, similar to the one previously confiscated, but containing different contents. This ledger featured detailed entries dated between March and September 1892, with each entry headed by a name, date, and series of measurements. Wickham recognized several of the names as corresponding to individuals who had died in the Trimble area during that period. The final pages of this ledger contained an entry dated October 11th, 1892, one day before Samuel Dockery's disappearance. The entry was headed with Samuel's name and included measurements and notations in the same unfamiliar script found in the previous ledger. Unlike previous entries that appeared complete, this entry trailed off mid-page and appeared to be unfinished, as though the writer had been interrupted or had abandoned the work for some reason. Despite intensive searching, neither Crow nor Samuel Dockery was ever found. The cave system was explored as thoroughly as contemporary equipment and techniques allowed, revealing a vast network of interconnected passages, underground streams, and chambers that extended for miles beneath the hills of southern Carroll County. Several passages were found that terminated in narrow fissures or vertical shafts that descended beyond the range of the rope and lighting available to the searchers. Other passages ended at underground streams too deep and swift to navigate safely. The consensus among those who participated in the search was that the cave system almost certainly connected to other cave systems in adjacent valleys, creating an underground network through which someone familiar with the passages could potentially travel for considerable distances without surfacing. The investigation continued sporadically through the remainder of 1892 and into 1893, but produced no significant new findings. Sheriff Wickham compiled a detailed report running to more than 100 pages, which he submitted to the county prosecutor and to the state attorney general's office in Little Rock. However, without a body, without a clear crime, and without the principal figure to charge, no legal action could be pursued. The case remained officially open as a missing persons investigation for Samuel Dockery, while the question of Crow's activities and whereabouts became a matter of speculation rather than active inquiry. The impact on the Trimble community was profound and long-lasting. Several families, including the Dockerys, abandoned their properties and relocated to other parts of the state or to neighboring Missouri. Those who remained were reluctant to discuss the events, and an informal code of silence developed regarding what had transpired in 1892. When newcomers arrived in the area in subsequent years, they found that longtime residents would deflect questions about certain topics and would offer warnings about avoiding specific locations, particularly Crescent Hollow and the cave system known as Hollister Cave. In 1896, Dr. Marcus Pemberton conducted his investigation as part of a broader study of medical practices in frontier regions. His work represented the first systematic attempt to document and analyze the events from a scientific perspective. Pemberton approached the matter with a skepticism appropriate to his medical training, but also with an openness to phenomena that might not fit conventional frameworks. His report, published in the Journal of Frontier Medicine in December 1897, under the title Unusual Medical Practices in the Arkansas Ozarks, a case study in frontier healthcare, provided detailed documentation of Crow's methods while carefully avoiding endorsement of supernatural explanations. Pemberton's most significant contribution was his analysis of the physical evidence, particularly the silver implements and the ledgers that Sheriff Wickham had confiscated. Pemberton arranged for metallurgical analysis of the implements by specialists at Yale University. who determined that they were composed of an unusually pure silver alloy that included trace elements of other metals in proportions that did not match any known commercial or medical instruments of the period. The craftsmanship was remarkably sophisticated, suggesting manufacture by someone with access to advanced metalworking equipment. Yet the designs themselves appeared to draw on much older traditions, incorporating symbols and decorative elements that resembled alchemical iconography from medieval European sources. The ledgers proved more challenging to analyze. Pemberton consulted with linguists and scholars of ancient languages at several universities, but none could definitively identify the script in which much of the text was written. Some specialists suggested similarities to medieval medical Latin mixed with symbolic notation systems used by alchemists and early chemists, while others noted resemblances to encryption systems employed by secret societies in the 18th and 19th centuries. The numerical notations, while written in standard Arabic numerals, followed calculation methods that Pemberton's mathematical consultants found difficult to interpret. They appeared to represent some form of biological or physiological measurement, but the units and the purpose of the calculations remained unclear. Pemberton also attempted to interview surviving witnesses, though he found many reluctant to discuss their experiences in detail. However, he did obtain substantive testimony from several individuals, including Rebecca Dockery, who had relocated to Springfield, Missouri, and Martha Wickens, who remained in Carroll County, but agreed to speak with Pemberton after he assured her that his interest was purely scientific and that he would protect her anonymity in any publications. From these interviews, Pemberton constructed a timeline of events and a detailed description of Crow's procedures that remains the most complete account available. Most controversially, Pemberton's report included a section titled Theoretical Considerations, in which he explored possible explanations for the phenomena reported by witnesses. He considered and largely dismissed conventional fraud as a complete explanation, noting that while Crow certainly employed psychological manipulation and possibly accomplices to create some of the disturbances families reported, several aspects of the case resisted such simple interpretation. The surgical skill demonstrated in the procedures, the sophisticated implements employed, and particularly the tissue anomalies Pemberton observed in his post-mortem examination, suggested genuine medical knowledge and capabilities beyond what would be expected from a mere charlatan. Pemberton cautiously raised the possibility that Crow had stumbled upon or deliberately practiced techniques related to what he termed residual physiological processes, theoretical mechanisms by which certain bodily functions might continue in limited form following clinical death. He noted that medical science in the 1890s had only recently established reliable criteria for determining death, and that the boundary between life and death remained less absolute than commonly assumed. However, Pemberton emphasized that even if such residual processes existed, this would not validate Crow's supernatural claims or his alleged ability to collect debts from the deceased. Rather, it might suggest that Crow had developed unusual medical techniques while wrapping them in mystical rhetoric to impress and control his clients. The report concluded with recommendations for further investigation and suggested that the case demonstrated the need for stronger medical licensing requirements and oversight of frontier health practices. However, Pemberton also noted that the scientific questions raised by the evidence deserved serious study, and he called for researchers to approach such cases with neither credulous acceptance nor reflexive dismissal, but rather with rigorous methodology and openness. to unexpected findings. The publication of Pemberton's report generated modest attention in medical and academic circles, but failed to produce the extensive follow-up research he had recommended. The case remained largely forgotten outside of local memory until 1923, when renewed interest emerged from an unexpected source. Professor Daniel Whitmore of the University of Arkansas, conducting research for a broader study of Ozark folklore and folk medicine, encountered references to the Carroll County events while reviewing newspaper archives and county records. Intrigued by the case, Whitmore spent the summer of 1923 in Carroll County, interviewing elderly residents who remembered the events and searching for physical evidence that might have been overlooked by earlier investigators. Whitmore's research, published in the Journal of American Folklore in 1925 under the title The Crescent Healer, Medicine, Magic, and Mystery in the Ozark Mountains, approached the case from an anthropological rather than medical perspective. Whitmore was particularly interested in the cultural context that allowed Crow to operate and the belief systems that influenced how community members interpreted their experiences. He documented numerous folk beliefs related to death, debt, and the relationship between the living and the dead that persisted in Ozark communities despite decades of modernization and increased contact with mainstream American society. Whitmore argued that Crow had effectively manipulated deep-seated cultural anxieties about both death and debt, two subjects that carried enormous psychological and social weight in frontier communities. The notion that debt survived death reflected genuine concerns in societies where economic obligations were often personal and relationship-based rather than institutionalized and abstract. Similarly, beliefs about the unquiet dead, spirits unable to rest due to unfinished business, appeared in various forms across many cultural traditions, including those represented in the ethnically diverse Ozark population. However, Whitmore also documented testimony suggesting that the events of 1892 had lasting effects that transcended simple folklore. Several elderly residents told him of ongoing reluctance to inhabit or even approach properties associated with Crow's activities. The Dockery farm had been abandoned since Samuel's disappearance and remained unoccupied despite multiple attempts by the county to sell the property for back taxes. Crescent Hollow had acquired a reputation as a place to avoid, and local hunters and travelers reported that animals seemed to shun the area, that vegetation grew sparsely near the cave entrance, and that overnight visitors often experienced disturbing dreams or unexplained sensations of being watched. Whitmore himself spent several nights camping near Hollister Cave as part of his research. His field notes, preserved in the University of Arkansas archives, describe experiences that clearly unsettled him despite his scholarly detachment. On his second night at the location, he reported hearing sounds from within the cave that he compared to human voices speaking in low tones, though he could distinguish no actual words. Investigation with a lantern revealed no source for these sounds. On his third night, he observed what he described as a faint, phosphorescent glow emanating from deep within the cave, visible only in conditions of complete darkness after his eyes had fully adjusted. This glow pulsed irregularly, suggesting it was not simply a reflection of moonlight or a product of his imagination. Whitmore attempted to penetrate deeper into the cave to investigate the glow's source, but found the passage blocked by a collapse that appeared relatively recent, possibly occurring within the preceding year or two. Most intriguing was Whitmore's discovery of physical evidence that had been missed or overlooked by earlier investigators. In a small side chamber approximately 300 feet into the cave system, he found a collection of objects that he documented through photographs and detailed description. These objects included several of the mysterious receipt cards bearing the Crescent symbol, though weathering and moisture had rendered most of them illegible. More significantly, he found what appeared to be a partial skeleton, partially concealed beneath fallen rock. The skeleton was incomplete, lacking the skull and several other major bones, and showed unusual characteristics that Whitmore, not a medical expert, could not definitively interpret. He collected several bones as specimens and arranged for their examination by anatomists at the university. The anatomical analysis, conducted by Professor Hiram Caldwell of the University of Arkansas Medical Faculty, produced a report that raised more questions than it answered. The bones, identified as human and probably from a male individual, showed several anomalies. Certain bones displayed unusual density and mineral composition, with elevated levels of silver compounds embedded in the bone matrix. Other bones showed evidence of what Caldwell termed extraordinary stress remodeling, patterns of structural change typically associated with extreme or prolonged physical stress of a type not commonly observed in skeletal remains. Most puzzling were marks on several bones that appeared to be deliberate incisions made with sharp instruments, incisions that had partially healed before the individual's death, suggesting they had been made during life and that the individual had survived for some period afterward. Caldwell cautiously suggested that the remains might be those of someone subjected to unusual medical procedures or experiments, though he emphasized that alternative explanations could not be ruled out. He noted that the incomplete nature of the skeleton and the lack of context made definitive conclusions impossible. The remains were eventually interred in an unmarked grave in the Berryville Cemetery, after no identification could be established and no family claimed them. Whitmore's research also uncovered additional cases that may have been connected to Crow's activities, but that had not been documented by earlier investigators. Through interviews with elderly residents and review of mortality records, he identified at least 8 additional deaths in Carroll and adjacent counties between 1890 and 1892 that were followed by reports of unusual circumstances, nighttime disturbances, or interactions with a mysterious medical practitioner. These cases suggested that Crow's activities may have extended beyond the Trimble community, and that the 17 cases documented by Sheriff Wickham represented only a fraction of his actual practice. Particularly intriguing were reports from Madison County, which borders Carroll County to the south. Several families in remote areas near the Buffalo National River described encounters in 1891 with a traveling healer who matched Crow's description and who employed similar methods, including the use of the Crescent symbol and unusual procedures involving the recently deceased. These reports suggested that Crow may have operated in the region for longer than previously believed, and that he may have moved between communities to avoid attracting too much attention in any single location. Whitmore's final assessment, while carefully avoiding definitive claims about the supernatural aspects of the case, acknowledged that Silas Crow, whatever his true identity and motivations, represented a genuinely unusual figure whose activities raised questions that extended beyond simple fraud or delusion. Whether Crow was a sophisticated con artist exploiting vulnerable communities, a practitioner of genuine but unorthodox medical techniques, or something more difficult to categorize, he had created a lasting impact on the region that persisted more than 30 years after his disappearance. In the decades following Whitmore's research, the case gradually faded from academic attention, remembered primarily as a colorful piece of Ozark folklore, rather than a subject worthy of serious investigation. The physical evidence held by various institutions was gradually lost or misplaced. The ledgers confiscated by Sheriff Wickham disappeared from county records sometime in the 1940s, possibly destroyed in a courthouse fire that damaged several archive rooms, though this was never confirmed. The silver implements studied by Dr. Pemberton were returned to Carroll County after his research concluded, but subsequently vanished from the sheriff's evidence storage. The skeletal remains analyzed by Professor Caldwell were interred without preserving tissue samples or detailed anatomical records beyond Caldwell's original report. By the 1960s, when a new generation of folklorists and historians began systematically documenting Ozark traditions, the Crescent Gila had become a legend rather than a documented historical case. Versions of the story circulated that bore only loose resemblance to the actual events, incorporating elements from other folklore traditions and embellishing details for dramatic effect. The factual foundation of the case, documented through official reports, newspaper accounts, and academic research, became obscured beneath layers of storytelling and reinterpretation. However, in 1982, a development occurred that briefly renewed serious interest in the case. During renovation work on an old house in Berryville, workers discovered a hidden compartment built into a wall cavity. Inside this compartment was a collection of documents including personal correspondence, financial records, and a manuscript that appeared to be a first-person account of events in Carroll County in 1892. The documents were turned over to the Carroll County Historical Society, which eventually concluded that the author was likely Martha Wickens, the diarist whose earlier journal had provided contemporary documentation of the events. The manuscript, covering approximately 80 handwritten pages, provided a more personal and emotionally detailed account than the official documents had offered. Martha Wickens wrote with the perspective of someone who had witnessed the events unfold within her community and who had struggled to reconcile her direct experiences with rational explanation. Her account confirmed many details from official reports, but also provided new information about community dynamics, interpersonal relationships, and the psychological impact of Crow's presence on Trimble residents. Most significantly, the manuscript contained passages describing encounters with Crow that Martha had apparently kept private during the original investigations. She wrote of a consultation with Crow in April 1892 regarding persistent headaches that had troubled her for months. She described Crow as unnervingly perceptive, accurately identifying details about her health history and family background that she had not disclosed. During the consultation, Crow had examined her using conventional methods, but had also performed what Martha described as a reading, during which he traced patterns on her forehead and temples with his fingers while speaking in a low voice in a language she did not recognize. According to Martha's account, Crow told her that she carried a debt inherited from her maternal grandmother who had died 10 years earlier. This debt, Crow explained, was not financial, but rather physiological, a burden passed through the family line that manifested as the headaches Martha experienced. He offered to address this inherited debt through a procedure that would require access to something belonging to her grandmother, preferably something that had been in contact with her grandmother's body. Martha, both frightened and intrigued, declined his offer. and Crow accepted her refusal without argument, though he warned that the headaches would likely persist and possibly worsen as the unpaid debt compounded over time. Martha's manuscript described her headaches continuing for several more months before gradually subsiding in late 1892, around the time of Crow's disappearance. She wrote that she had often wondered whether there was any connection between these two events, and whether her refusal to accept Crow's procedure had somehow contributed to the escalation that led to Samuel Dockery's disappearance and Crow's flight from the area. These passages reveal the guilt and uncertainty that haunted witnesses long after the immediate events concluded. The manuscript also provided Martha's observations about changes in the community following Crow's disappearance. She noted that several families who had accepted his procedures seemed to experience unusual patterns of health and fortune in subsequent years. Some prospered in unexpected ways, with crops yielding abundantly despite poor conditions affecting neighbors, or with family members avoiding illnesses that swept through the community. Others experienced the opposite, suffering a series of misfortunes and deaths that seemed disproportionate to chance. Martha carefully avoided claiming that these patterns definitively resulted from Crow's procedures, but she documented them in detail, leaving readers to draw their own conclusions. The discovery of Martha Wickens's manuscript prompted a brief resurgence of academic interest in the case. In 1985, Professor Eleanor Wainwright of the University of Chicago published an article in the Journal of American Studies titled Debt, Death, and the Frontier Healer, revisiting the Carroll County mystery that analyzed the case through the lens of economic anthropology and ritual studies. Wainwright argued that Crow's practices reflected a sophisticated understanding of the symbolic relationships between economic obligations, social bonds, and mortality that characterized frontier communities. She suggested that, regardless of the supernatural claims, Crow had tapped into genuine anxieties about the perpetuation of debt across generations and the ways in which the dead continued to exert influence over the living through memory, inheritance, and unresolved obligations. Wainwright's analysis connected the Carroll County case to similar phenomena documented in other cultures and historical periods, including medieval European practices related to masses for the dead, Asian traditions involving ritual payment of ancestral debts, and various folk customs in which the living performed actions on behalf of the deceased to settle outstanding accounts. She argued that Crow represented not an isolated aberration, but rather a manifestation of widespread human concerns about the proper relationship between the living and the dead. Concerns that frontier conditions and economic precarity had intensified rather than eliminated. In 1994, journalist Thomas Brennan conducted an investigation for a series of articles published in the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette that brought the case to broader public attention. Brennan traveled to Carroll County to interview residents, explore the historical sites, and attempt to separate documented fact from accumulated legend. His articles, published over 3 consecutive Sundays in October 1994, provided a comprehensive overview of the case, while also documenting the contemporary state of locations associated with the events. Brennan found that Crescent Hollow remained largely undeveloped, and that the site where Crow's cabin had stood was still identifiable through foundation stones and remnants of the structure. Local residents told him that the property had never been successfully redeveloped despite several attempts over the decades. One attempt in the 1950s to build a hunting cabin had been abandoned when construction workers reported tool theft, unexplained equipment failures, and a general sense of unease that made them reluctant to remain at the site. The cave system, known as Hollister Cave, remained accessible, though informal barriers and warning signs discouraged exploration. Brennan himself explored the accessible portions of the cave with a local guide and documented his experience. He described the cave as extensive and complex, with multiple levels and passages that would require technical climbing skills and proper equipment to explore fully. In the main chamber that Sheriff Wickham had documented, now more than a century after the events, Brennan found no remaining evidence of Crow's activities beyond some carved symbols on the walls that might or might not date from the 1890s. However, his guide, a longtime resident who had explored the cave extensively since childhood, reported that certain passages deep in the system remained deliberately avoided by local cavers, who maintained an informal tradition of not venturing into specific areas without clear necessity. Most intriguingly, Brennan documented reports from several contemporary residents who claimed to have had unusual experiences in the vicinity of Crescent Hollow and the cave system. These reports, while varying in details, shared common elements: unexplained lights visible near the cave entrance at night, sounds resembling human voices or movement emanating from the cave when no one was inside, and a persistent sense of being observed when spending time alone in the area. Several hunters and hikers reported experiencing sudden, intense anxiety attacks when passing near certain locations, anxiety so severe that they abandoned their activities and left the area despite having no rational explanation for their fear. Brennan interviewed 3 separate individuals who reported seeing a tall, thin figure dressed in dark clothing in the vicinity of Crescent Hollow during the early 1990s. 2 of these sightings occurred in daylight, while the third happened at dusk. In each case, the witness observed the figure from a distance, and when they attempted to approach or call out, the figure retreated into the forest or, in one account, appeared to enter the cave. These reports bore sufficient similarity to historical descriptions of Crow to raise questions about whether someone had adopted his appearance and methods, or whether, as some locals suggested, something of Crow himself remained associated with the location. The publication of Brennan's articles generated significant public interest and led to increased visitation to the Crescent Hollow area, much to the dismay of local residents and landowners. The Carroll County Sheriff's Department found itself responding to multiple calls involving trespassers on private property and amateur explorers attempting to access the cave system without proper experience or equipment. In 1995, a group of college students from the University of Arkansas, conducting an unauthorized nighttime exploration of the cave system, had to be rescued after becoming lost in the passages. One member of the group required medical treatment for what was officially described as an anxiety attack, though unofficial accounts suggested the students had encountered something in the cave that had terrified them beyond simple disorientation. In response to these incidents, local authorities and landowners installed gates at the main entrances to Hollister Cave and posted prominent no trespassing signs throughout the area. These measures reduced but did not eliminate unauthorized access. To this day, the cave system attracts occasional visitors drawn by the historical mystery, despite warnings about the dangerous conditions and the lack of any significant evidence remaining from the 1890s events. The most recent academic treatment of the case appeared in 2003, when Dr. Patricia Morehouse of the University of Missouri included a chapter on the Crescent Healer in her book, Frontier Medicine and Folk Healing, in the Ozarks. Morehouse approached the case from a medical history perspective, analyzing Crow's practices in the context of 19th century medical pluralism and the competition between various healing traditions for legitimacy and clientele. She noted that the period when Crow operated coincided with significant transitions in American medicine, including the professionalization of medical practice, the establishment of licensing requirements, and increasing skepticism toward traditional and alternative healing methods. Morehouse argued that Crow represented an extreme example of entrepreneurial medical practice on the frontier, where the absence of regulatory oversight allowed practitioners to offer services that would have been impossible in more developed areas. She documented dozens of similar cases from across the frontier regions during the same period, involving healers who made extraordinary claims and employed unusual methods, though few cases matched the Carroll County events for their combination of sophistication, documentation, and mysterious outcome. Most significantly, Morehouse obtained access to previously unknown correspondence between Dr. Marcus Pemberton and several of his medical school colleagues, in which he discussed the Carroll County case in more candid terms than his published report had employed. In a letter dated March 1897 to Dr. Frederick Harrison at Yale University, Pemberton wrote that he had deliberately softened certain findings in his published report to avoid ridicule or accusations of credulity. The tissue samples he had examined from individuals subjected to Crow's procedures showed, in Pemberton's private assessment, cellular changes that could not be satisfactorily explained through any known medical mechanism. He described finding what he termed organized structures within the tissue that resembled neither normal cellular architecture nor any pathological formation with which he was familiar. Pemberton wrote to Harrison that he had submitted samples for microscopic analysis at 3 separate institutions under coded identifications, avoiding mention of the source or context to obtain objective assessments free from bias. All 3 institutions reported similar findings: the presence of unusual crystalline structures within cellular tissue, structures that appeared to contain silver compounds integrated into organic matrices. The crystalline formations showed patterns suggesting deliberate organization rather than random deposition. One analyst compared them to the controlled crystal growth achieved in certain laboratory procedures, noting that their presence in human tissue was unprecedented in his experience. Pemberton's private correspondence revealed that these findings had troubled him deeply and had contributed to his reluctance to pursue further research into the case. He wrote to Harrison that he feared his career and reputation would be damaged if he published findings that suggested the possibility of techniques or knowledge beyond conventional medical understanding. Yet, he also expressed frustration at the limitations of contemporary science to investigate such phenomena properly, and he voiced hope that future researchers with more advanced tools and less restrictive professional environments might revisit the questions the case had raised. These revelations from Pemberton's private papers, made public through Morehouse's research, prompted renewed discussion among medical historians about the case. Several researchers suggested that modern analytical techniques, including DNA analysis, advanced spectroscopy, and other methods unavailable in the 1890s, might provide new insights if any tissue samples or other biological evidence could be located. However, systematic efforts to locate such evidence have proven unsuccessful. The samples Pemberton preserved have long since been lost or destroyed, and attempts to locate graves of individuals subjected to Crow's procedures with the hope of obtaining remains for analysis have been blocked by ethical concerns and, in some cases, by descendants who maintain that their ancestors should not be disturbed for research purposes. The question of Crow's identity and ultimate fate remains unresolved. Despite extensive research by multiple investigators over more than a century, no definitive identification has been established. The name Silas Crow appears in no medical school records, licensing documents, or other official databases that have been searched. No photographs of Crow are known to exist. The physical descriptions provided by witnesses are consistent across sources but generic: tall, thin, middle-aged, with dark hair and unusually pale complexion. These characteristics could apply to countless individuals and provide no basis for identification. Several theories have been proposed. Some researchers suggest Crow was a trained physician who had lost his license or fled legal troubles in another state and adopted a false identity to continue practicing in the frontier regions where credentials were rarely checked. Others propose he was a self-educated healer who had acquired medical knowledge through apprenticeship or independent study, and supplemented conventional techniques with traditional practices drawn from various cultural sources. More speculative theories suggest connections to secret societies, occult organizations, or esoteric traditions that supposedly preserved ancient knowledge about death, consciousness, and the liminal states between life and death. The question of whether Crow survived his disappearance in 1892 or perished in the cave system remains similarly unresolved. The skeletal remains discovered by Professor Whitmore in the 1920s have been speculatively identified by some researchers as possibly belonging to Crow himself, though the evidence is far from conclusive. The anomalous characteristics of those remains, including the elevated silver content and unusual bone modifications, could support such identification, but equally they might belong to someone else subjected to Crow's procedures, or even to one of his potential victims or accomplices. Reports of sightings of a figure resembling Crow have continued sporadically throughout the 20th century and into the 21st. While most researchers dismiss these reports as misidentifications, folklore, or even hoaxes, their persistence across more than a century creates a puzzle. If the sightings reflect reality rather than imagination, they might indicate that someone, either Crow himself or a successor, continued to operate in the region long after the events of 1892. Alternatively, the consistency of the reports might simply demonstrate the power of legend to shape perception, causing people to interpret ambiguous experiences through the lens of familiar stories. The physical evidence that once existed has now largely vanished. The ledgers, implements, receipt cards, and tissue samples that once offered tangible connections to the case have been lost to time, neglect, and the vagaries of institutional record-keeping. What remains are documents, newspaper articles, official reports, academic papers, and personal accounts that provide a textual record of events but lack the physical proof that might allow for definitive conclusions using modern analytical methods. The site of Crescent Hollow continues to exert a strange fascination on those who learn of its history. The cave system remains largely unexplored beyond the most accessible passages, with extensive areas that would require technical expertise and equipment to investigate. Several formal caving expeditions conducted in the 1970s and 1980s documented miles of passages extending in multiple directions from the known entrances, including several passages that terminate in areas requiring underwater diving or technical climbing to penetrate further. Whether these unexplored areas contain additional evidence related to Crow's activities remains unknown. Local residents maintain an ambivalent relationship with the case. For some, it represents an embarrassing episode of frontier superstition and medical fraud that reflects poorly on their community's history. For others, it constitutes a genuine mystery that demonstrates the complexity and strangeness of historical experience. A few families quietly maintain that their ancestors' interactions with Crow produced real effects, whether through medical knowledge, psychological manipulation, or mechanisms that remain poorly understood. The broader significance of the case extends beyond its specific details to raise questions about the nature of medical knowledge, the boundaries between legitimate practice and fraud, and the ways in which frontier conditions created spaces where unconventional practitioners could operate outside the constraints of professional regulation. The case also illustrates the challenges of historical investigation when dealing with events that witnesses experienced as genuinely anomalous, but that leave ambiguous evidence subject to multiple interpretations. What makes the Carroll County case particularly disturbing, even more than a century after the events, is the combination of careful documentation and persistent uncertainty. Unlike purely legendary accounts that lack factual foundation or resolved cases where all questions have been answered, the Crescent Gila presents documented events that resist complete explanation. Multiple credible witnesses reported consistent experiences. Official investigators documented physical evidence and testified to findings that troubled them. Medical researchers discovered anomalies they could not explain using available knowledge. Yet no definitive conclusion emerged that could satisfy all observers or account for all evidence. The case serves as a reminder that historical truth often remains incomplete and that the past contains episodes that challenge our frameworks for understanding. Whether Silas Crow was a sophisticated con artist, a practitioner of unusual but genuine medical techniques, or something more difficult to categorize, his brief documented presence in Carroll County created effects that persisted long after his disappearance. The families who encountered him, the investigators who documented his activities, and the researchers who later studied the case all struggled to reconcile their observations with their expectations about what should be possible. To this day, researchers debate whether modern investigation using contemporary scientific methods could resolve the remaining questions about the case. Some argue that locating and analyzing any remaining physical evidence using techniques unavailable to earlier investigators might provide definitive answers. Others maintain that too much time has passed, too much evidence has been lost, and too much uncertainty clouds the historical record for any conclusive resolution to be possible. The debate itself reflects broader questions about the limits of scientific investigation and the nature of historical knowledge. The local oral tradition surrounding the case has evolved over the generations, incorporating new elements while preserving core details. Stories are told of visitors to Crescent Hollow experiencing vivid dreams involving a tall, thin man offering cryptic bargains. Hunters report avoiding certain areas where animals refuse to venture and where an inexplicable sense of wrongness pervades the atmosphere. Some accounts claim that those who spend too long near the cave system begin to hear whispered voices, making offers of services related to debts both financial and existential. Whether these contemporary reports reflect genuine, ongoing phenomena, the power of suggestion and folklore to shape experience, or simply the human tendency to generate stories about locations associated with historical mysteries, remains an open question. What is documented is that Crescent Hollow and the cave system, known as Hollister Cave, continue to hold a unique place in local consciousness more than 130 years after the events that brought them to wider attention. The archives of Carroll County contain the physical residue of the case, boxes of documents, including Sheriff Wickham's extensive reports, copies of newspaper articles, transcripts of interviews, and the correspondence and papers of various researchers who studied the events. These materials are available to scholars who seek access, though they remain little consulted. The mystery they document has receded from public consciousness, remembered primarily by local historians, folklore enthusiasts, and the occasional researcher investigating frontier medical practices or Ozark mysteries. In the autumn, when the hills of northwestern Arkansas display their characteristic colors and the temperature begins to drop as winter approaches, it remains possible to visit the site where these events unfolded. The drive from Berryville southward through increasingly remote valleys eventually brings travelers to the area once known as Trimble. Though that community name has long since faded from use, Crescent Hollow can be located with some difficulty, identifiable by the distinctive landforms and the remnants of old properties that careful observers can still detect beneath more than a century of forest regrowth. The cave entrance remains visible, though the iron gates installed in the 1990s discourage casual exploration. On quiet days, particularly in the early morning or evening hours when shadows lengthen and the forest sounds seem to carry unusual weight, visitors sometimes report feeling what multiple accounts have described across the decades. A sense that something about the location remains unsettled, that the events of 1892 left traces that time has not completely erased. Whether these sensations reflect objective reality or subjective psychology remains, like so much else about the case, a matter of interpretation and belief. What cannot be disputed is that the documentation exists, preserved in archives and historical records testifying that in 1892 something unusual occurred in this isolated corner of Arkansas. A man calling himself Dr. Silas Crow practiced medicine according to principles that defied conventional understanding. He claimed that the dead could pay their debts through procedures he performed under the sign of the Silver Crescent. Families who encountered him reported experiences that troubled them for the remainder of their lives. Investigators who documented his activities found evidence they could not fully explain. And then, as mysteriously as he had arrived, Crow vanished into the extensive cave systems beneath the hills, leaving behind questions that persist to this day. The final words belong perhaps to Martha Wickens, whose manuscript discovered in 1982 provided such valuable testimony. In her concluding passages, she wrote that she had spent decades attempting to understand what she had witnessed in 1890, trying to reconcile her direct experience with rational explanation. She had consulted books on medicine, psychology, and natural philosophy. She had discussed the matter with educated people whose opinions she trusted. She had prayed for understanding and clarity, yet in the end, she wrote, she remained uncertain about fundamental questions regarding what had occurred and what it meant. Martha concluded her manuscript with a passage that later researchers have found particularly haunting. She wrote that on certain nights, particularly in autumn, when conditions resembled those of October 1892, she would sometimes wake in the darkness and think she heard faint and distant, a voice speaking in that strange language Crow had used during her consultation. She could never be certain whether the voice existed outside her mind or within it, whether it was memory or imagination or something else entirely. But she wrote that the uncertainty itself seemed to be the point, that perhaps some questions were not meant to be answered definitively, and that the space between knowing and not knowing contained its own kind of truth. The crescent moon, symbol of transition and transformation, rises each month over the hills of Carroll County, as it has for millennia, and will continue to do so long after all who remember the events of 1892 have themselves passed beyond the threshold that separates the living from the dead. Whether that threshold is absolute or whether, as Silas Crow claimed, some commerce between the two states remains possible, is a question that each person must answer according to their own experience and understanding. The documentation of what occurred provides no definitive resolution, only testimony that in one time and place events unfolded that challenged and continue to challenge our assumptions about what lies at the boundary between life and death, health and disease, debt and payment. The case of the Crescent healer remains open in the sense that questions remain unanswered and evidence remains incomplete. Those who wish may consult the archival materials, visit the sites, and draw their own conclusions. The story endures because it touches something fundamental about human experience: our uncertainty about death, our anxiety about obligations that might extend beyond our lives, and our uneasy sense that conventional understanding may not encompass all possibilities. Whether Silas Crow discovered genuine secrets about the nature of life and death, whether he was merely a clever manipulator exploiting fear and grief, or whether the truth lies somewhere between these extremes, the shadow he cast across Carroll County in 1892 has never entirely lifted, and the questions he raised continue to echo more than a century after his disappearance into the limestone darkness beneath the Arkansas hills.